At this point, critiquing wokeness has become old news. The right has chosen wokeness as its latest boogeyman, with whole accounts and marketing campaigns dedicated to ending wokeness. And in an attempt to make themselves stand out from the rest, some leftists have tried to do the same. So my expectations going into Woke Ouroboros, Peter Coffin's latest book, couldn't be any lower. But the book took me by surprise. Don't get me wrong, it's not good, but it's not as bad as I thought it was gonna be. Woke Ouroboros establishes itself firmly as a critique of wokeness from the left, and we get a few of the usual critiques here, like the outsized focused representation gets when we think of oppression. We've got black presidents and a movie about crazy rich Asians that have been held up as important milestones, but for most black Americans and Asians across the world, nothing fundamentally changes even with black and brown faces in high places. The reason for this, as Peter goes on to argue, is that wokeness is a tool used by the elites to obfuscate how power really operates and blame individuals for racism. We're taught to view race as essential to who we are, which conveniently for the elite makes every interaction we have with people of a different race inherently racial, sowing division and distrust. It also makes us self-segregate the same way Star Wars fans and Star Trek fans do into identity fandoms, making it so on top of keeping us divided, our identities also create marketing opportunities for companies to take advantage of. Hashtag buy black, or oh, look at how diverse the CIA is, now we have to support it. The best example of this is Robin DiAngelo and her book White Fragility. Peter is right to call both the book and the author out for the damage it's done to our understanding of race. To DiAngelo, if you're white, you're racist, pure and simple, and her teachings have essentially been canonized by liberal institutions. Today, DiAngelo is a diversity consultant teaching white people how racism is all their fault. It's the kind of attitude that gets us performative actions like a video Peter brings up of the 2020 BLM protests, where an official organizer calls for the whites and the blacks in the protests to separate into different groups while they're being attacked by the police. Thankfully, the people in the crowd had the sense to not self-segregate, which would make it easier for the police to attack black people. But regardless, this is woke ideology at work. Peter cites a 2015 study that found just how successful wokeness has been for the elite. It finds that companies that have more diverse workplaces are less likely to see successful unionizing efforts. A surprising finding that is genuinely disappointing to see. Peter argues it's an unfortunate consequence of our ideological self-segregation. They ask, was diversity a failure? The conservative would surely say so, but this is a critique from the left. Peter doesn't think so, but they do advocate that instead of succumbing to cynical wokeness, we need to acknowledge that we're all more alike than we are different, and we need to unite as workers to fight the real causes of systemic oppression and racism. That's about where the good parts of the book end, and we got a whole, 15 minutes left to the video? So how bad can it really be? For starters, while the book goes into the history of the political usage of the term woke, there's no mention of the revolutionary origins of ideas like identity politics. Peter portrays them almost entirely as tools for the elite, papering over, as an example, the history of the Combahee River Collective, an organization of queer, black, feminist socialists that coined the term identity politics. It completely ignores how, for example, even in a socialist organization, women were often subject to domestic abuse and sexual violence by revolutionary men. These were realities that made conceptualizing new ways to think about the working class and the contradictions within it necessary. It wasn't about collecting oppression identifiers like Pokemon cards for clout. It was about highlighting unique struggles that often get ignored when you reduce the lives of 90% of people to one group. Identity politics was meant to foster solidarity and compassion among the people, with a little bit more attention focused on the finer details. And it did so by building off the philosophical theory of standpoint epistemology, which Peter defines as the idea that an individual's experiences and knowledge vest specific authority regarding those experiences and knowledge. To explain, they use the example that if you witness a crime, you have authority on that event since you literally witnessed it. So other people that weren't there should obviously defer to you. That's an example where standpoint epistemology makes sense. But Peter's definition of this term is lacking. It's not just the idea that we are the best authority on our own experiences. When talking about identity politics, it's better defined as the idea that some knowledge is socially situated, and your standpoint, your identity, your place in the world may enhance or limit your ability to acquire that knowledge. So as an example, in a conversation about women's voices being ignored in the workplace, the standpoint of a man and a woman in the same workplace are different. They've had different subjective experiences that might, for example, have the woman believe that the workplace is unfairly treating her, while the man might have no idea. Let's say, for the point of argument, the truth is that the workplace does indeed show preferential treatment to men. The man is going to have a harder time getting to that truth. It's not impossible for him to get to the truth. He can talk to the women in his workplace, he can read and learn, whatever, but by default, his subjective standpoint makes that harder. I've had that happen before, where, for example, a woman in a political organization complained that it was a bit of a boys' club and women weren't included in the same capacity as men. I had no idea, but after considering it after it was brought up, it started to make sense. That's the logic of standpoint epistemology playing out in, the real world. Peter argues that when fetishized to the extremes of wokeness, standpoint epistemology ends up devolving to listen to X people's voices and X people shut the fuck up. For Capital, the benefit here is clear. They can find, as Peter often uses as an example, a fat black trans man wearing a diaper as their spokesperson to promote capitalist interests. And since they sit atop the oppression hierarchy, you should just shut up and listen to them. And minus Peter being edgy with the whole fat black diaper thing, they definitely have a point. In that woke politics circa 2016-2017 were fucking awful. Think of the BuzzFeed era of the internet where artists were just casually selling fuck white people merch, which just is not productive politics. And the more woke among us definitely have an inclination to defer to voices we believe are more marginalized. But Peter misses that this isn't a new phenomenon exclusive to the wokeness of the 2010s. Back in the 1970s, the FBI was using tactics that abused the act of deferring to the marginalized to wreck leftist organizations. I have an old ass video about it that you probably shouldn't watch since it's so old, but it's right here if you want to. But basically, they'd pay off some working class person that checked all the identity boxes and have them try to derail the movement as best they could. And people would listen to them because they checked all those boxes. If this was a thing even before wokeness, then there's something Peter's just completely missing here. The book Elite Capture sets out on a similar journey as woke Ouroboros, a critique of identity politics from the left. But instead of dismissing these ideas as just tools that favor the elite, Elite Capture declares that this isn't an issue exclusive to identity politics. And I want to read a quote that feels like it was almost written to Peter Coffin and their book almost directly. Critics and detractors of identity politics and wokeness claim that they reflect the social preoccupations of rich white people or the professional managerial class. And they're not completely wrong, but the fact is just something that identity politics, wokeness, and the like have common with everything else in our lives. The increasing domination of elite interests and control over aspects of our social system. That's because almost everything in our social world has a tendency to fall prey to elite capture. In other words, it's not just that wokeness is too white or too liberal, it's that everything is. Everything in society, especially things that enter the mainstream, tend to be warped to favor elite interests. That's how revolutionary concepts like identity politics have now become common in racial sensitivity training courses across companies the world over. The problem is in how these ideas have been warped, with the two main culprits being essentialism and pessimism. The author of White Fragility teaches that the mere act of being white condemns you to racism. It's an unwashable original sin. Other authors, specifically of the Afro-pessimist point of view racism as eternal. And I agree with Peter that in order to overcome these tendencies, we need to have hope in our hearts and view each other as more than just our race. But woke Ouroboros chooses some strange targets to critique. For example, Peter criticizes Disney's leaked diversity, equity, and inclusion program for having things like a privilege checklist for their employees to complete. When I was in grade school, I completed a similar task where we sought to measure how heavy our backpacks were. That was a metaphor for what struggles we were going through. The purpose of the exercise was to be a humbling experience where we would reflect on our struggles and the struggles of others. It was an attempt at generating more empathy and interconnectivity among us, not less. And as an ideal, this is the strength of identity politics. It can teach us more about ourselves and others and help us relate to each other. Sure, we might look different, but maybe we both have divorced parents, or maybe we're both from the same part of town, and so on. But to Peter, this is a big corporation blaming individuals for racism, which I don't see. Here's another horrible example. Peter analyzes a tweet that has over 150k likes from a black woman complaining about a microaggression. It reads, "Today's microaggression. My white manager attempts to get to know me and asks me, 'So what do you do for fun besides change your hair every week?' HR will be hearing from me tomorrow." According to Coffin, this is an instance of the woke Ouroboros consuming itself. The black woman in question has been ideologically conditioned by woke ideology to assume that this is an instance of racism, when in reality there's hard to read any racism here. As Coffin notes, the victim in question outright admits her manager is trying to get to know her. The manager likely had only good intentions, the comment being made over the very real observation of a woman changing her hair often. How could this be an instance of harmful racism? As Peter notes, it probably isn't. Except it's not a stretch to consider this a microaggression. Black women's hair is commonly understood to be cultural, and making light of it, or gentle ribbing as Peter puts it, could be reasonably interpreted as othering. But to Peter, this is the woke Ouroboros. They literally spend pages on this one tweet. It's so unnecessary and actually harmful to working class unity to downplay the everyday shit some people deal with. I don't think anyone is pretending this is on the same level as systemic racism, but come on now, this is real. Or you have this tweet of a white guy saying, "It amazes me that any straight white dudes don't see the privilege we have. It's not subtle." Nothing controversial really, just saying white privilege is a real thing that exists. Well, Peter goes on another multi-page long rant on how invoking white privilege in this way is the equivalent of saying, "I'm white, and that's why I'm above you." I'm not even fucking kidding. He goes on to say that saying white people have power on the basis that they're white is the equivalent of saying white power. It's some truly deranged shit. And this is me trying to be charitable, okay? Like, I get what Peter is trying to say, that when the idea of white privilege is sloganized without reference to history or structures of power, white people just seem to have power just because. And by consequences, white people become oppressors just because. Even some poor white person who can't pay rent becomes the oppressor just because. But you cannot say saying white privilege and white power are equivalent. Like, no one has ever heard someone say white privilege is real and interpreted that to mean that white people are biologically superior. Like, it's the kind of insane shit that only someone who hasn't gone outside for months would write. And on the topic of white people, we can't ignore that theoretically, philosophically, politically, that we live in a settler colonial society. As a group, white Americans are quite literally oppressors on this land as a settler population. We shouldn't use this as an excuse to say fuck white people, but we can't deny this reality despite poor white people existing. We're supposed to use this knowledge and the logic of identity politics to develop a clear understanding of systems of oppression and their various connecting intersections, grounded with an understanding of class and capitalism, and develop coherent politics from them. We don't discard white people, but acknowledge our interdependence with them against the common enemy of the people. As the book Elite Capture advocates, we need to move beyond wokeness and deference and go further towards a politics of interdependence. Centering the most marginalized, in my experience, has usually meant handing conversational authority and attentional goods to whoever is already in the room and appears to fit a social category, while deferring to the voices of the more marginalized is a practice that has its heart in the right place. Deferring to the Chicano or gay person in the room with you isn't actually deferring to the most marginalized. Doing so would mean FaceTiming the 1/3 of the human population that doesn't have reliable access to drinking water, or the hundreds of millions of people facing displacement due to climate change. Instead, you're just passing the mic to whoever fits marginalized categories to someone already in the room. And as we've covered, this is a politics that's ripe for elite capture. To opt for deference rather than interdependence may soothe short-term psychological wounds, but it does so at a steep cost. It may undermine the goals that motivated the project, and it entrenches a politics that does not serve those fighting for freedom over privilege. I suspect Peter would say that they're an advocate of interdependence over deference. But woke Ouroboros, in diminishing the reality of microaggressions and reducing identity politics to a straw man, shows that they're not interested in interdependence, just a vague notion of working class unity where they don't actually listen to marginalized voices. And while there are brief glimpses of interesting points here and there are other books that criticize identity politics and wokeness from the left that are much less insulting than this. If only Peter had read them instead of listening to Caleb Maupin. Anyway, what do you think? Let me know in the comments down below.